Leslie Wells, Connection Coach here. Let's talk about attachment and boundaries. We're going to focus today on the dismissive avoidant. So, Leslie Wells, Connection Coach, I help individuals heal, thrive, improve their romantic relationships by looking at things through an attachment lens. So, first of all, we have 3 insecure attachment styles, and they all are not great with boundaries. So for the anxious preoccupied, because they get so much of their worth inside the relationship, and because their biggest fears are fears of abandonment and rejection, they tend to not have any boundaries for themselves. They will let their partner basically plow through their boundaries because they are so afraid that if they set boundaries and uphold them, that their partner will become upset and they will be eventually rejected and abandoned. Now, the fearful avoidant, which is the disorganized attachment style, they are all over the place. They have both the anxious and the avoidant side in them. They are also very bad at boundaries. They will crash right through other people's boundaries. A lot of times they will go into a fight response, in which case they are showing up in so much pain that they really are not good at respecting other people's boundaries. Their internal wound is a wound of betrayal, feeling like people are not going to show up well for them in relationships and that they're going to be let down, hurt, rejected, disappointed, that they're going to be betrayed in some way by their partner. And so they typically will get very upset and experience a lot of little betrayals and sometimes big ones in relationships. And when they get upset, they go into that fight response and they usually will speak unkindly. They can also go into their avoidant side where they will stonewall and shut out, and it will be a hard push. So they kind of plow through other people's boundaries. And the same token, when they actually set boundaries, they don't do it very good. They will set it as a protest behavior, hoping that you will talk them out of that boundary, so they don't really mean it. So a lot of times fearful avoidance in an argument or in a fight, when they start to feel hopeless or helpless or really not understood or betrayed, then they will say, you know what, I'm done with this relationship, and they'll basically threaten to leave or threaten that their relationship is over, and they're not really meaning that as a true boundary. What they really want you to do is come chase after them, so they're not really upholding the boundary, and it's not a true boundary for them. The dismissive avoidant is the attachment style where really boundaries are very rigid and they're not very flexible with their boundaries. And so they sort of seem to control everything in the relationship with their boundaries. They sort of determine when you're going to have conflict. If you're going to have conflict, they will check out of a conflict. They will be basically like, okay, I'm done, I'm not participating. And they may not say this out loud, but their actions will let you know that they're no longer present and engaged, and they've basically left that conversation. And that usually is a trauma response. They're sort of disassociating, they're going into a freeze response or a flight response. So it's not that they're doing this intentionally, it is a subconscious thing. But because closeness, connection, intimacy, commitment, expectations feel so bad to them, they create all of these rigid boundaries in order to create emotional distance between themselves and their partner. So that looks like them dictating when you're going to actually sit down and have conflict, how long that conversation is going to be, how long into any intimate conversation is going to be, and whether or not they're even going to show up in an intimate conversation. They will often dictate the nature of the relationship when it's identified as a committed relationship and when they're not ready for that. They sort of determine that. They determine when they're going to reach out, when there's going to be closeness, intimacy, connection. They sort of lead all of those things, and you're just sort of waiting for them to determine when they're going to lean in, when you're going to have a conversation, when there's going to be real details, told from their side, because they also will tend to keep things very private. So they will have really strict boundaries around what they're willing to reveal and how vulnerable they're going to be with you. They really struggle with vulnerability. They also really get burdened by their partner's needs, and they really, because they want to keep their autonomy and their independence in a relationship, they really do not like for their partner to feel dependent on them. So the partner's dependence on them, those expectations, and really needing them to be accountable will often feel overwhelming to them, as will their partner's emotions. And so they will create really rigid boundaries around those sorts of things, and you'll see that they're not willing to take accountability or take responsibility for things that the partner needs in a relationship. And that can even be like household duties, splitting chores, who's going to do what, as far, and also your emotional needs as well. They really don't want to feel like you are dependent on them. So they will create boundaries and rigid boundaries where they're basically like, I'm not going to do these things. I'm not responsible for it. And that's because they grew up in a household where they were responsible for all of their own stuff for survival, especially their emotional stuff. So they really got used to handling things alone. A lot of them were emotionally dealing with things from a place of survival. So they learned very young to internalize things and take everything sort of on themselves. So they don't understand why you want to lean on them and be dependent on them, because they're quite the opposite. In the beginning of a relationship, a lot of times you will see dismissive avoidants really put strict boundaries around communication and the time that you spend together. So they love long-term relationships. That's really their ideal relationship, because there's not a lot of expectations, there's not a lot of commitment, you're not relying on them a lot, and they're not having to give up a lot of their time, and they don't feel like they're going to lose themselves in the relationship and become over enmeshed in the relationship. And so they will set, in the beginning, when you're in the dating phase of a romantic relationship, they will really put control and put boundaries around how often you reach out, whether or not they're going to text back. A lot of times those conversations and those texts are one word short answers, and that's sort of a boundary to let you know that they're not willing to make themselves available very much or communicate very much. And they'll also really resist and put boundaries around bids for connection and intimacy. And they do all of these things as a way subconsciously to push their partner away, because intimacy, closeness, expectations, commitment, all of those things make them feel uncomfortable and send them into a trauma response. And so it really is a subconscious way to push their partner away with all of these boundaries. However, they're actually usually pretty good about respecting the boundaries of other people whenever you set something up, especially if it's something that means that they don't have to do any extra effort or show up in any significant way for you. The problem is they don't understand the root cause of these boundaries. They just know that they're shutting down, disassociating, withdrawing, and having these strict things in place to create space. So they don't really understand that. What they need to be able to do is to understand the root cause of why they are feeling like they need to back away and pull away, and be able to address those things. They need to be able to directly communicate what's going on for them and why they need those boundaries. And that looks like really understanding their attachment style and understanding what their needs are inside of a relationship. And those are things like peace and harmony, lack of conflict, feeling like things can be fun and there's a good friendship involved there, feeling like they're not being criticized, and feeling like they have their own time and space to be a separate person outside of the relationship. But they don't address these things and talk about their needs directly. They just sort of disappear, pull away, back away from the relationship, leaving the partner very confused and feeling very abandoned and rejected. Other times, quite an oxymoron, is they will let people cross their boundaries because they struggle so deeply to feel and identify their emotions that a lot of times, if you can't feel your emotions and you can't feel the physical sensations in your body, you don't always know when a boundary has been crossed for you. So sometimes they actually miss boundaries that people have crossed for them because they're not able to self-reflect and check in with themselves to know when there's a feeling or emotion that tells them something's wrong and that they have an unmet need, or something has been stepped on that's a wound for them or a need for them. And then other times their need to avoid conflict will mean that they will disregard their own boundaries and they will sort of appease to be able to move past the conflict. So if you bring them a problem and they feel like you're bringing it to them in a critical way and they really desperately want to avoid that conflict, and dismissive avoidants always want to avoid conflict, when you bring that to them, they may appease you and just say whatever you want them to say so that the conflict disappears. In that regard, they're sort of dishonoring themselves and allowing you to overstep a boundary for them, but they're just trying to avoid the conflict. So there you have it. That is how the dismissive avoidant shows up when it comes to boundaries in a relationship.